Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Battlefield 6 for PC, Xbox Series S and X, and PlayStation 5. What you'll be seeing throughout this video is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter, and despite the name, the 18th entry in the Battlefield franchise. It was developed by what is referred to as Battlefield Studios, but that's actually a conglomerate of Digital Illusion C, better known usually as DICE, which is more specifically the Swedish company that started the Battlefield franchise, as well as Ripple Effect Studios, which was formerly known as DICE Los Angeles, as well as Criterion Games and Motive Studios. There was apparently also some work done on the game by Ridgeline Studios before that one got shut down. All of them are subsidiaries of EA, which is of course the publisher. And this game was hyped up to absolutely ludicrous levels leading up to its launch. It was being called a return to form, as the gaming media so likes to use these days, for the Battlefield franchise, whose previous entry, Battlefield 2042, was so utterly atrocious I couldn't even review it. I revisited that game a couple of years later, and by then they had patched out a lot of the technical problems that it suffered from, but it never recovered from the severe gameplay deficiencies it had, among other things, and its utter failure basically meant that Battlefield 6 would be the make-or-break moment for the franchise. If they had screwed this one up, then that would all but guarantee the demise of the entire Battlefield franchise, as well as probably one or two or even all of the studios involved with it. I guess it's a good thing for them then that the open beta saw tons of traffic to the point where the servers couldn't really handle it and they had to have waiting queues, and then the game sold well enough to become the biggest launch in the franchise's history. And if you were only paying attention to what the shills were saying about the game, you would get the impression that it's this wonderful, amazing gameplay experience that really brings the Battlefield gameplay back. Funny thing about that is the people saying this generally have not played Battlefield in its true form. At absolute best, they might have played Bad Company 2, which was already a severely compromised version of Battlefield-style gameplay, although it was arguably the last game that still at least kinda felt like a Battlefield game. From there, the series just continued to spiral further and further away from what made Battlefield compelling in the first place, in favor of catering to the Call of Duty crowd. The idea here being that Call of Duty and Battlefield are apparently direct competitors, at least as far as EA is concerned, so in order to steal away more of the audience from Call of Duty, they have to become more like Call of Duty. This manifested in things like shrinking map sizes, increasingly obnoxious cosmetics, increasingly obnoxious unlock systems, increasingly unbalanced gameplay, and especially a push further and further away from proper combined arms warfare like was exhibited in the classic Battlefield games in favor of more infantry-focused gameplay. This means that there has not been a truly good game in the Battlefield series for nearly 20 years. The last truly good game in the series was Battlefield 2. Since then, every single game in the franchise has had some major problems that have prevented it from being truly good or especially outright great. The closest they've managed to get to the highest peaks this series has achieved with Battlefield 2 was Battlefield 2142, which was a fairly weak follow-up to Battlefield 2, but still not necessarily an outright bad game, just a disappointment compared to Battlefield 2. But that was still targeting the PC market. Ever since they started targeting the console market, the series has just been spiraling further and further down the drain. This continued unabated until we finally got to the lowest point this series has ever been, Battlefield 2042. A game so utterly atrocious that on launch it was practically unplayable. And I don't think people truly appreciate what that meant for Battlefield 6. 2042 was so atrocious that the next game in the series, simply being functional software, would make it a masterpiece by comparison. When the standards of the franchise have fallen so far that they have gone past dinosaur bones and are nearing the core of the Earth, you have to take any positive sentiment about the games after that point with not simply a grain of salt, but rather a mountain of salt. And this is where we find ourselves with Battlefield 6. Standards for the franchise have never been lower, and the kind of players that made Battlefield what it was at its height left the franchise a long time ago. Most of them have moved on from this franchise and are either no longer gaming at all, or they have left any kind of action genre at all because they're just getting too old for that crap. Or, if they are still playing action games, chances are they are playing the slower-paced, more tactical experiences like Hell Let Loose, Squad, and Arma. Games that offer combined arms experiences and require heavy coordination with their teams. All of which are things that used to drive the Battlefield franchise, but have not done so for quite a long time now. And that brings me to the major question of this whole review. Does Battlefield 6 manage to break the curse of the franchise for the past 20 or so years, and actually live up to the words return to form? Or does EA still not get it? Well, let's just delve into the meat of this thing and find out. And as we usually do, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. This runs on the latest version of the Frostbite engine, which is of course DICE's proprietary engine that has now become EA's general engine for pretty much everything. Although there are still a few studios within EA using alternate engines like Unreal, for example. But of course the Battlefield series has been sticking with the Frostbite engine, and generally speaking, DICE does a pretty good job of maintaining this engine and working within it. However, there have been several entries in the series that suffered pretty severely from engine problems, with the most common of these being things like severe bugs and glitches just absolutely wrecking entire matches or just completely crashing the game, or of course severe performance problems including things like memory leaks and such like that, as well as something that I'll be talking about a bit more when I get to the gameplay section, which is things like netcode problems. And the previous entry in the series, Battlefield 2042, suffered from these kinds of problems in spades. Things like bugs and glitches ranging from more mild annoyances on up to outright game crashes, and sometimes even weirder stuff than that, as well as severe performance problems where the game was just running like absolute garbage, even if you had an absolute beast of a rig at the time. And of course the netcode was an absolute mess as well. Things like severe problems with hit registration or just disconnecting from matches and things like that. All of those problems were severe enough in Battlefield 2042 that the game was barely even playable at the best of times. I would generally consider it to be pretty much unplayable on launch. They did patch out a lot of these issues over time, but it took them quite a while to get it to something vaguely resembling a playable state. Now, I bring all of that up because you need to understand the context of the series before you go into what Battlefield 6 does with the engine. Because again, as I said in the intro, even simply being functional software is a massive improvement over Battlefield 2042. And generally speaking, that is the case with Battlefield 6. It doesn't really suffer from any major engine problems. Generally speaking, performance is solid on a wide variety of rigs. For context, I am running a Ryzen 9 5900X, 64 gigs of RAM, and an AMD 9070 XT. And when running the game at 1080p, generally speaking, it is running well above 60 FPS at all times. In fact, unless I'm running this thing with ultra textures, it really never dips below about 80 FPS. Most of the time it's somewhere between 90 and 110, and obviously at frame rates like that, it's a pretty smooth experience. That said, if I run this thing with the ultra textures enabled, then I run into one of the game's engine problems, which is a VRAM memory leak. Now keep in mind, even if I'm enabling the ultra textures, I should not be running into memory problems on my graphics card. It has 16 gigs of VRAM. Even if I'm enabling high resolution textures, it should run fine at 1080p. And if I play a single match, it actually does run fine. It's a lowered performance compared to just running it on the high texture setting instead of the ultra texture setting, but not by a significant enough margin to really make that much of a difference. I mean, we're talking maybe about 5 FPS at absolute most. But what I found out pretty quickly was that if I just kept playing matches with the ultra texture setting enabled, then there would just be this catastrophic filling of VRAM, and it would absolutely destroy my performance. I would go quite literally from about 90 to 100 FPS in one match to the next match, absolutely tanking down to about 20 FPS. Now, of course, the way to fix this is to not install the HD texture pack and run ultra texture settings, but if you were already doing that, then you can fix the problem when you encounter it by restarting the game, but then it will just happen again when you move between matches, because it's not properly clearing out the VRAM when you're running those ultra textures. So, something to keep in mind there. Thing is, you can barely even notice a difference between the ultra and the high settings anyway when it comes to textures, so there's not really much reason to actually run this thing with the high-resolution texture pack as well as the ultra textures enabled. So definitely an annoyance, but easy to work around. And thankfully it was the only major engine problem I was running into throughout the vast majority of my time playing. Now you will occasionally see some graphics glitches or physics glitches in particular, because that's a common thing across really any game with a physics system. And you might run into a crash here or there, but it's a pretty stable game overall, so definitely a dramatic improvement on the technical side of things compared to 2042, but then you move beyond the technical aspects and you get into the actual presentation part of it, how it actually looks and sounds, and it's not really much of a step up over 2042. That's not to say that the game looks bad or anything, it actually looks quite good, and considering how well it runs, that's obviously a good thing. But you will notice some things like some animation reuse from 2042, particularly with things like weapon handling animations, which is always odd to me because a lot of the animations feature you flicking the safety on, dropping your old mag, sticking a new mag in, and then flicking the safety back off. Which, look, I know they think it looks good, and they probably think it's proper weapon handling, but quite literally no one in a combat scenario is going to be doing that. It would be way too easy to flick the selector over to something you didn't intend, whether you were originally intending to go semi-auto and you accidentally flick it onto full auto, or you were intending to go to full auto and you accidentally flick it onto burst or something like that. And as long as you just don't have your finger holding the trigger down, it's not really going to be a problem. You just keep your finger off the trigger, you drop your old mag, you stick a new mag in there, you either slap the bolt catch or rack the bolts or whatever it may well be to charge the weapon if you have to, and then you just go on your merry way. Instead, DICE decided that some, but not all, of the weapons needed to have their safeties flicked on and off constantly whenever you're reloading, which is just ridiculous, so it just slows the reloads down and generally affects the gameplay in a slightly negative way. Because funnily enough, it does actually slow the reloads down enough to where it can be a matter of life and death in this thing, so maybe they should have just not included that particular feature of the animations from 2042. Anyway, the rest of the animations are generally quite solid across the board, whether it's character or vehicle animations, and the destructible environments do look pretty good at first until you realize that there are a lot of limitations on what can be destroyed and what can't. And while it is certainly a much better experience of environmental destruction than 2042 was, it's still nowhere near the heights of the series with the likes of Bad Company 2 in that regard. And think about it this way, sure, you can destroy a lot of the walls on buildings, but generally speaking, you cannot collapse the buildings. Whereas in Bad Company 2, you could collapse a whole lot of the buildings, including the MCOM station buildings. In fact, that was one of the more frustrating strategies people would use. Instead of running in there and setting a charge on the MCOM station in the rush mode, they would just destroy the building around it. It would collapse on the MCOM station and destroy it. And there was basically nothing the defending team could even do about it, which is of course why they removed that feature in subsequent games. But the point still stands that you're not getting that level of destruction. You're not even getting the level of destruction you would see with Battlefield 4 with their Levolution mechanic, where some of the maps had admittedly very scripted destruction, but they would have very large, wide-scale destruction that was pretty cool to look at and would actually change the outcome of a match because it would change the dynamic of the map. And I don't know whether it's because they were playing it too safe or if they're running into engine constraints at this point, but you simply won't get that level of destruction with what is currently available in Battlefield 6. So while in the grand scheme of the Battlefield series, the destruction is a bit of a letdown compared to some of the previous entries, it's definitely a significant step over 2042, but admittedly that's not really saying much. That game barely even had destruction at all. Beyond that, generally speaking, the game looks pretty solid. Good modeling, good texture work, good shaders and special effects and everything. And the only other significant problem I can think of is more of a preference thing, because of course this game requires you to use TAA, temporal anti-aliasing, which is the common scheme for anti-aliasing in most modern games. Admittedly, here it looks a lot better than it does in a lot of those other games that use it. It has a nasty habit of causing severe blurring effects and making everything just look like you've smeared petroleum jelly all over the screen all the time. It's not quite as bad in Battlefield 6 as it is in a lot of those other games, because a lot of those other games are running in Unreal Engine 5 and run like complete garbage, and it is a way more noticeable problem at a lower frame rate than it is at a higher, more stable frame rate like you're getting in Battlefield 6. So you will occasionally notice some blurriness in the image, you'll occasionally notice some smearing effects and ghosting effects, but it's usually not that big of a deal in this particular game. They do list a few other anti-aliasing algorithms in the game's options, but all of those are other forms of temporal anti-aliasing, so you get similar effects. Some of it is just graphics card specific, so AMD versus NVIDIA, and weirdly enough they even include Intel's temporal anti-aliasing solution, XeSSAA, which you pretty much never see, so that's kind of neat to see. But it's all temporal anti-aliasing in one form or another, and the only other option you have is to use an experimental option to turn anti-aliasing off entirely and just deal with jagged edges. And that's just really unfortunate. But with the exception of a few of those blemishes that I've mentioned here, generally speaking, this game looks pretty good, and it runs well, and it's stable software, so all that significant improvement over 2042. Where things get a bit messier is in the sound design, most specifically with the voice acting, which is not the best. It's not terrible, but there are a lot of sour lines in this thing. I think a lot of that's just the script is not particularly good. And the battle chatter just doesn't really have quite the intensity that you would really hope it does. It's not awful, but it just never really feels right, for lack of a better way of describing it. But then you move into the actual sounds of warfare, so the ambient noise, the vehicle noises, gunfire, explosions, that sort of thing, and for the most part, that's all very well done. That is something that Battlefield has been excelling at for a long time, and that is also the case here, but there are a few guns that just don't really sound like they have quite enough punch behind them. Prime example there being the 1911 or the M45 as it is in this one, which just sounds remarkably weak, even if you're running this thing with the war tape setting like I do, and that is something that I would highly recommend you do as well, because it emphasizes a lot of the gunfire and explosion sounds to make them sound a lot punchier and more echoey in the environment, whereas the default sound mixing is just too clean and gamey, for lack of a better way of describing it. But even on the war tape setting, the M45 just sounds like an absolute pea shooter, even though it's one of the more powerful handguns you have available. So there's definitely some work they need to do on some of that. It's nothing particularly major. We're talking in the realm of tweaking sound effects, or maybe swapping out a sound effect here or there. Nothing particularly crazy, but it would be the kind of thing that would help to make the gameplay feel a bit more satisfying and just make the entire experience a bit more immersive. But arguably the biggest letdown with the sound design is the soundtrack, which I have completely forgotten because it's barely even noticeable throughout the entire game, even if you have the volume cranked up on it. That is how incredibly generic and uninteresting that soundtrack is. Now, funnily enough, weak and generic is still a dramatic improvement over what was present in Battlefield 2042. That stuff was so bad it practically made your ears bleed. But when even the obnoxious noise that was the soundtrack of Battlefield 3 is more interesting than the soundtrack of the new game, that's a bit of an issue. Thankfully, the soundtrack doesn't really play that much of a part in the Battlefield experience. For the most part, you're going to be caring way more about the actual battlefield noise itself, so all the gunfire, explosions, the battle chatter, the general ambiance, just immersing you in the absolute carnage of warfare, rather than any kind of backing orchestral tracks or anything like that. But the one place where it does actually matter a lot is the single-player campaign, because in a single-player campaign, or just a storyline of any kind, music is there to help emphasize what's going on and help create a specific mood, and it just doesn't really do that here. so that's definitely a bit disappointing. However, when you bring all of the presentation together, generally speaking, it works quite well, even if they do play it a bit too safe with the environmental destruction. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although story doesn't matter quite as much in a game like this because it's primarily a multiplayer-focused game. So let's go ahead and get the entire single-player portion of the game out of the way first. Battlefield 6 is set in the years 2027 and 2028 amidst a world where NATO is severely fractured. Following a series of political controversies, a lot of former members of NATO have broken off from the organization and are now trusting their security to the private military company Pax Armada, which has been aggressively expanding its control over large swaths of the world in direct competition with NATO. Now, the game starts out with a bit of a prologue set in 2027, where you play as a US Marine named Murphy, who is part of the withdrawal phase of NATO from the nation of Georgia. They are turning it over to Pax Armada, and the whole thing is supposed to be a relatively painless, peaceful thing, until suddenly Pax Armada just launches a full-scale assault and wipes out most of the NATO presence there, with you making a heroic final stand against oncoming Pax Armada forces, with all of the members of your squad being taken down one by one until Murphy is the only one still alive. And while it looks like he's going to go down with the rest of his squad, he does manage to survive the whole thing thanks to rescue efforts from some fellow Marines, and thus he lives to fight another day. From there, the game time skips into what is the present timeline of the game, which is in the year 2028, and by this point NATO is in full-scale war with Pax Armada, and it's remarkably even, which makes less than no sense, because Pax Armada is a private military organization. It is more or less impossible to conceive how it could possibly have the sheer amount of funding and personnel available to fight a full-scale war on multiple fronts with all of NATO, even if NATO is fractured and has lost a few of the member states. They try to work their way around this utterly absurd notion by saying that Pax Armada has managed to obtain some secret NATO technology that enables them to negate a lot of the advantages that NATO has, but it is a ludicrously flimsy excuse. Here is the real reason that Pax Armada is not simply some other nation-state or some other alliance of various countries, like, say, the Warsaw Pact or something like that, or a modernized version of the Warsaw Pact. They are deliberately making it a private military organization because that means they can't shift any kind of antagonist label on any particular country. You see, there are certain countries in the world, namely China and Russia, that really don't take kindly to being portrayed as antagonists in video games and tend to ban the game in their country if it portrays them as any kind of antagonist. And to put it very simply, EA can't afford to let this game get banned in a market as large as China, so they have to choose an antagonist faction that is generic and safe enough to not really be offensive to any particular country, no matter how utterly absurd the situation ends up being. Now sure, it's not only EA that are doing this, pretty much all of the AAA space is doing it. You look at the likes of Activision over the last several Call of Duty games, and it's always some shadowy organization or some paramilitary organization or something along those lines that's not officially affiliated with any actual country, with the only exception there being the situations where they kind of can't get away with doing that because it's set in a historical conflict like World War I, World War II, etc. But anyway, that's the real reason behind Pax Armada being the antagonist faction in this game, and it is just painfully obvious throughout the entire game. The end result of this is that it's basically impossible to take the story of this game seriously, even though it plays itself deadly seriously. It acts like it's some very serious war drama that ends up being built on a completely absurd premise that never really goes anywhere. I mean, sure, Pax Armada are the big evil bad guys, and they do big evil bad guy things, and they invade various countries and try to impose tyrannical rule on them. But there never really seems to be any kind of rhyme or reason for it, and then at the very end of the game they try to pull a twist ending on you with a reveal about the true nature of Pax Armada and where it really comes from and all that, but you see it coming from a mile away, It is hilariously cliche, and it still just doesn't make any damn sense. And what you end up being left with once you take all of the absurd nonsense out of the storyline and just focus on the things that actually kind of work, you're left with individual vignettes of just going into a level to tackle specific objectives as whatever member of Dagger Squad you happen to be playing as at that point, none of whom are particularly interesting because they're all very one-note characters that have no depth to them whatsoever. And for the most part, it's all very self-contained. You have your general objective, which you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it because it's told to you in the moment, but it doesn't really matter all that much in the grand scheme of things anyway. And then you just go and complete the objective, and you move on to the next level, and it cuts back to this frame story in the present day, because the level you just played was meant to help explain where things were leading up to the point that's being shown in the frame story, and it just doesn't really work very well. At absolute best, you end up with a bland, generic, modern military shooter campaign where you're doing the same kind of things you've done in military shooter after military shooter over the past couple of decades at this point, where you just run around in linear levels, although in Battlefield 6 the levels are larger scale, they're still linear, and so you're still running around these environments, you're completing specific objectives, usually stuff like destroying specific objectives by planting charges on them or something along those lines. And then you just move on to the next objective until eventually you get to the end of the level, and then you move on to the next level. There's not really anything to say about any kind of squad commands. It's not a tactical shooter. You can tell them to shoot at stuff or to throw grenades or something like that at a particular spot, but it's never really all that useful. You might as well just be doing everything yourself anyway. And while Battlefield is meant to give the impression of very large-scale conflict, everything you're doing tends to be very narrowly focused, small-scale stuff in close-quarter environments, and so you end up with yet another example of a weak attempt at copying Call of Duty's campaign style. And while it's fine in terms of how it actually plays, it never achieves anything beyond that. Now, to be fair, in the grand scheme of the Battlefield series, that means that this is one of the better campaigns. That's not saying much because most of the Battlefield campaigns are utterly atrocious. So even something that is very mediocre, like the campaign in Battlefield 6, ends up smelling like tulips by comparison. But let's face it, nobody was playing this game for the single player. It was basically just a nice thing to have that would help explain the setting that you're going to be playing the multiplayer matches in. And while it does accomplish that goal, you're left with this constant feeling that the campaign could have been so much more if they really put some time and effort into making it unique and try to focus on some of the strengths of the Battlefield series. Like, for example, with the opening level of Battlefield 1, where they actually did something really cool with it, where you would play as one character, and then when that character died, it would pull the screen back and switch over to a different character at a different part of the map doing something else, and you would play through that section, and it would just continue on. But of course, even in Battlefield 1, that was only done in that introductory level. Everything else was very bland, generic military shooter campaign stuff. And it just seems like campaign is something that this franchise is never really going to be able to nail. And I understand why. The main draw of Battlefield is, of course, the multiplayer, but between how many people were working on this game, how long it took to make, and how much money was invested into it, the players deserve a hell of a lot better of a single-player campaign than what they actually got. But of course, regardless of how weak the single-player experience is, what people really care about with the Battlefield franchise has always been the multiplayer experience. And in Battlefield 6, this is actually split between two separate games, effectively. Those are, of course, Battlefield 6 and Battlefield REDSEC. REDSEC being a free-to-play battle royale experience that is basically just Call of Duty Warzone, but with a Battlefield 6 coat of paint. And since there's far less to talk about in REDSEC, I'll go ahead and get that out of the way before I move into the main multiplayer component. The available modes are Battle Royale split into duos and quads, so you're either playing with one other person in your squad or up to 3 other people in your squad. And it plays out like every other Battle Royale you've seen over the past decade or so, where you just parachute into the map somewhere with your squad, collect gear, and fight the other squads until eventually only one squad is left standing. Or if you don't want to specifically play the Battle Royale mode, then there is also the Gauntlet mode, where you squad up with up to 3 other players, and then it gives you a series of objectives. And the idea is that as you complete these objectives, you accumulate score, and the lowest scoring squads will be eliminated over the course of several rounds of play, until eventually, of course, you end up with only one squad still standing. And unlike in the Battle Royale mode, where you have only one life supplemented by a single respawn, and you have to scavenge your gear, in the Gauntlet mode you can still respawn during the rounds, and you have free access to whatever you've unlocked as part of the multiplayer progression, and can customize your loadout freely. Regardless of which of these modes you choose, you will be dropping into the single map that is available in REDSEC, and in the case of the main Battle Royale mode, you'll be able to wander around the entire breadth of it. It's a fairly large map with a mixture of open spaces and densely packed urban environments, and as you wander through the various buildings, you will find loot caches that you can open to find weapons, upgrade kits which will add attachments to your weapons, ammunition, throwables, gadgets that would normally be class restricted in the main multiplayer, but you can use regardless of what class you're playing in the Battle Royale mode, and some additional single-use items like being able to call in an artillery barrage. The scavenging element and being able to move across the entire map is removed in the Gauntlet mode, where instead it drops you into specific subsections of the map to complete whatever objectives you have, and as I mentioned previously, you have the loadout system included there. It does still have the armor plate system that the Battle Royale mode does, however, so in addition to your regular health statistic, you have a limited number of armor plates that you can put on in order to give yourself an extra barrier against damage. Once your armor plates are broken, then you'll start taking health damage until eventually you drop. And when that inevitably happens, one of your squad mates can revive you. And this process is considerably easier in the Gauntlet mode, because if one of your squad mates is playing the medic class, then they still get the defibrillator like they do in the regular multiplayer. So all it takes is a quick zap from the defibrillator, and then you're back up and running. This is not, however, the case in the regular Battle Royale mode. When you go down, you need the specific defibrillator item that you can scavenge in the various environments in order to quickly revive your squad mates, and even then, it still has a bit of a timer that you have to hold down in order to actually revive your teammate, whereas in the regular multiplayer and in the Gauntlet mode, you just pull out the defibrillator item and you just press the fire button a single time, and that gets them right back up. Now, another distinction of this system between the Gauntlet and regular Battle Royale modes is that in the Battle Royale modes, you have 2 armor plate slots, and so you can have 2 of them active at a time, and in the Gauntlet mode, you only have 1 slot. Now, the idea behind this is that because the Battle Royale modes are much more high risk in terms of general gameplay experience than the regular multiplayer, where you're going to be in the respawn queue an awful lot, and that'll just get you right back into the action. In the Battle Royale modes, obviously, if your squad gets completely eliminated, then you're out of the match and you have to go back into the matchmaking queue. Now, with the Gauntlet mode being more of a round-based affair where you do actually have the ability to respawn, it's less high stakes than the regular Battle Royale modes, so they don't feel the need to give you multiple armor slots, and the armor plate that you slot in doesn't protect you from that much damage. In the regular Battle Royale mode, on the other hand, you become a damage sponge, and that means that the gunplay in the regular Battle Royale mode is atrocious. You see, even though you're going to be seeing the respawn queue in the regular multiplayer an awful lot, simply because that's the nature of the Battlefield franchise, you're still fairly tanky when it comes to most incoming damage. The only real exceptions there are if you get hit in the head with a sniper rifle or a DMR, or if you get blasted with a full load of buckshot up close from a shotgun, or an upper chest or headshot from a slug, and you can spend an awful lot of ammo just taking down a single enemy. When you expand the amount of damage an enemy can take, you're dragging out the time to kill even further, and when you get to the level you experience with the Battle Royale mode, where you have the dual armor plate system, you're having to dump entire magazines into enemies before they will go down. Whereas in the regular gameplay experience, you're going to dump maybe about 7 or 8 rounds into them, and in the Gauntlet mode, you're dumping more about half or 3/4 of a magazine into somebody to bring them down. This wouldn't be quite as much of an issue if the gunplay in Battlefield 6 didn't emphasize recoil so much. You see, Call of Duty Warzone can get away with this kind of system because in addition to the absurdly generous aim assist where it practically aims for you, and the very limited recoil you experience on pretty much all of the weapons, you can just dump a lot of rounds onto an enemy very easily. Whereas in Battlefield, the gun is jumping around a lot more, and you're going to have a lot more errant shots. Not only that, but they've also implemented cone of fire mechanics so that even if you are aiming directly at an enemy, you can fire a shot at them and it will still not hit them. Now, if you're playing a traditional Battlefield mode like Conquest, that's not necessarily that big of a deal, because the emphasis is not meant to be entirely on infantry combat, it's meant to be on combined arms warfare. So you're working together with your team and your squad in order to accomplish objectives, to lay down suppressing fire, that kind of thing. That doesn't happen in the Battle Royale mode. It's only squads versus squads. It is almost exclusively infantry combat. Oh sure, there are vehicles, but they're mostly just trucks with maybe a machine gun mounted on them at absolute most, unless you get to one of the vehicle trailers and happen to have a vehicle unlock token, maybe from completing a mission, which I'll talk about here more in a moment, and that will allow you to open the trailer to get something like a tank. But even though vehicles are available, you almost never actually see anybody using them because there's not really much point to. Unlike in the main multiplayer mode, you have limited vehicle ammunition in the Battle Royale mode, and funnily enough, anti-vehicle launchers are common enough in the various caches scattered around the map that you're actually more vulnerable in a vehicle than not being in one, so why bother using a vehicle unless you are desperately trying to escape the encroaching ring and you just need some extra speed? I mean, hell, even if you hop into a properly armored vehicle like a tank, it doesn't really matter because anti-vehicle weapons are rather plentiful in the Battle Royale mode, so chances are, even if you do manage to hop into a tank, you're going to get taken out before you can really do much of anything with it. As a result, the vast majority of the Battle Royale experience is going to just be running around on the ground as a soldier and fighting infantry versus infantry, with the occasional person or squad using a vehicle, mostly ineffectually because, again, it's just so easy to take them out most of the time. And the only part of it that really adds anything resembling variety is the missions that become available once you drop in, where you can select a mission for your squad to complete, and it will be things like aligning communication dishes, or taking out specific targets, or destroying an MCOM station, or something along those lines. Pretty straightforward stuff that is also present in the Gauntlet mode, but as dedicated rounds as opposed to a fleeting incidental mission that will then give you a series of rewards if you manage to complete it, such as superior weapon drops or airstrike tokens or something along those lines. And this is also where you'll get the access tokens for vehicle trailers that I mentioned earlier, and those will allow you to open up the trailers and gain access to the vehicles inside them after it takes them an awfully long time to open. These missions get very repetitive very quickly, and so they really don't do much to actually expand the variety of gameplay experience as you're messing around with the Battle Royale mode, and the entire experience just becomes a really crappy version of what we already saw for years with Call of Duty Warzone. It just absolutely screams follow the leaders syndrome, where they tried Battle Royale previously in 2042 and it was a complete failure, but that wasn't free to play. You had to buy Battlefield 2042 to be able to play the Battle Royale mode, so obviously that wasn't going to succeed when so many other Battle Royale games out there were free to play anyway. But of course, with EA trying to target the Call of Duty crowd, they just took a look at what Call of Duty Warzone was doing and said, you know what, we gotta do that, but utilizing the power of the Battlefield 6 engine, and the end result is absolute garbage. Quite literally, the only thing that Battlefield REDSEC brings to the table that other Battle Royale games don't necessarily have is some degree of environmental destruction. And that is nowhere near enough to make it stand on its own as a Battle Royale experience. And on top of that, it doesn't remotely feel like a Battlefield experience. There is no combined arms warfare to speak of, the squad system is severely de-emphasized to the point where it's basically just there to determine who your teammates are, and who can actually revive you, because that's about all that it's really good for. The class system is severely nerfed in the Battle Royale mode, to the point where the only things that really matter with it are that the engineer class gets their welding torch tool like they normally do in the regular multiplayer, and that is the only class that can open certain safes scattered around the map that will allow you to gain access to some extra gear. Other than that, the various classes mean very little. I mean, with the weapon bonuses that each class gets, it's gonna depend on if you happen to find weapons scattered around the map that are advantageous to use for you before you end up getting eliminated by other players. So, for example, if you jump in as a recon class, your class gives you benefits with sniper rifles, but if you happen to not find any sniper rifles and instead, say, find a light machine gun, well, you can still use it, but you're not going to get the bonuses that the support class gets for using light machine guns, so you're going to be weak with it versus somebody on the support class using it. And the same is true for any of the classes. If you don't find something that's advantageous for your class to use, you don't benefit from any of those weapon bonuses, and the class ends up being largely irrelevant other than whatever gadget you happen to spawn in with, which is the welding torch for the engineer, the motion sensor for the recon, the supply bag for the support class, and the stim for the assault class. And only the engineer's welding torch gets any kind of unique gameplay mechanic in the Battle Royale associated with it. So for the most part, Battlefield REDSEC feels like exactly what it is, just a poor copy of Call of Duty Warzone, and it feels wildly out of place in Battlefield, which wouldn't necessarily be as much of a problem if it were completely standalone, but it's not, because it interfaces directly with Battlefield 6 in almost every way. In fact, there are cosmetics and such that were in the base game, but were listed as currently unavailable up until the launch of Battlefield REDSEC. And that is when they became available in Battlefield 6, as long as you complete challenges specifically in REDSEC. Meaning, if you want to unlock things for use in the base game, you have to play the cancerous growth known as REDSEC in order to unlock those things. You can't simply, crazy thought here, play the game that you actually bought and wanted to play in the first place in order to unlock the things that were available in the game from the very first day, but were blocked off because they wanted to shoehorn them into REDSEC and try to force people into playing REDSEC just so they could pad the REDSEC player numbers. That is not only downright insulting to the player's intelligence, it just reeks of desperation, because it's abundantly clear EA knows REDSEC cannot stand on its own. But if the single player is weak and the REDSEC mode is pathetic and cannot stand on its own, what ultimately needs to carry the experience of Battlefield 6 is the core multiplayer experience. And that's where things get really messy even before you jump into a match. See, I've refrained from talking about the user interface up to this point, but to put it simply, the interface in this game is crap. It's not quite as bad as 2042's was, but it's still quite poorly designed and can be pretty annoying to navigate depending on what you're trying to do. See, when you boot the game up, it doesn't just kick you into the main menu like you would expect. Instead, it puts you to the logo screen and tells you to press the spacebar, which I assume would be the start button on the consoles, in order to begin. Once you do that, it goes through verifying the shader cache, because that's something that every modern game has to do, apparently. And then, before they introduced REDSEC and the Season 1 content, it would finally kick you to the main menu and you could go about your merry way. But once they introduced Season 1 and REDSEC, every single time you start the game, you have to skip through the intro videos for the Season 1 content and REDSEC. And then it gives you a static screen telling you to check out REDSEC that you have to skip through. And then you finally get to the main menu. Once you finally get to the main menu, you are presented with the in-game advertisements. Now, these are thankfully only for things inside the game, so it's basically just things like, hey, these are currently available cosmetics, or hey, these are the currently featured modes, this is the new update, check out the content in the update, things like that. Thankfully, at time of recording at least, they haven't decided to do something as obnoxious as, hey, check out these other games from EA, or something along those lines. But frankly, considering it's EA, I wouldn't put it past them. But anyway, Point is that it gives you that stuff first, which is something you would kind of expect to see, but what you would really expect to see is more that tucked to the side, and then all of the actual stuff you're more interested in doing, things like getting into the loadouts, or going directly into matchmaking queue, or going into the server browser, or anything like that. Those should be the things that are emphasized, not these massive images with some text on them saying, hey, look at this thing. But of course, modern UI designers are taking pretty much all of their design cues directly from streaming services like Hulu, Netflix, etc., so you're gonna get a really shitty interface. But anyway, you're presented with the announcements, and you're probably not gonna want to interact with them at all, so you're gonna want to go do something else. And to that end, you have a few options. Now, at the very top of the screen, you have the sections, which starts with play. That's where you're ostensibly going to be going to get into the matchmaking queues and such, as well as loadouts, battle pass, challenges, store, and profile. Now, I'll talk about more of those in a bit, but profile is the only one that you'll not really be messing around with too much, because that's where you just go to view what your stats are and edit some of your cosmetic items for your player profile. So whatever dog tag you have, what your player emblem is, what your player title is, that kind of thing. Pretty inconsequential stuff. But then directly to the right of profile, there's something that looks kind of like a gear or cog. That is where you go to edit all of your settings. Why they opted for something that inconsistent with the rest of that interface, I don't really know. Maybe they thought it would be more recognizable to iPhone users, I guess. I really don't know what their mentality was behind that. But already, on the main screen, before we've really delved into anything in particular, you have inconsistency, and that is never a good thing. Anyway, to the right of that, you'll see a yellow bee with a box around it. That is the symbol for Battlefield coins, and it'll have however many Battlefield coins you have listed there. And while I will talk about that more later, I will say that they do give you some of these as part of the Battle Pass. So as you're playing the game normally, you will occasionally unlock some Battlefield coins. And that's even if you haven't purchased the Battle Pass, but we'll talk about that stuff more later. And to the right of the listing of Battlefield coins is whatever your current rank is, as well as your player emblem that you can edit in the profile screen. Below that, you will see a plus, as well as a letter, and an icon that looks like two people standing next to each other. Now, these stand for adding people to your party, as well as the mailbox and your friends list. And below that, you will see an indication of the tab key. That is the shortcut for accessing these interfaces. Obviously not the most intuitive thing, but for things that you're not really going to be interacting with all that much, not the biggest deal. But things get a lot messier when you're actually trying to just play the game. Because as you'll notice on the left side of the screen, there are a bunch of very small category indicators. It starts with Bulletin, then goes to Featured, Campaign, Multiplayer, REDSEC, Community, and Training Grounds. These are the categories you will be navigating in order to find whatever it is you're actually trying to do, unless it's one of those things that I've mentioned previously. Now, the Bulletin is what I've already described, where it's saying things like, you need to get the Battle Pass, and all that kind of crap. Below that is the Featured section, and this is the stuff that they want to draw your attention to that will actually let you play the game. Most likely it's going to be whatever they've introduced in the most recent update, so it might be things on whatever new maps are available, or whatever modes are introduced, or in the case of when they introduce Battlefield REDSEC, it'll just have Battlefield REDSEC stuff in there as well. Obviously the content of the Featured section is going to change a fair bit, so you're not necessarily going to find what you're looking for there. If you continue down to the next section, that is Campaign. You may not be able to do anything with this unless you have installed the campaign. This is where another weird, annoying aspect of this game comes into play, because depending on how you install the game, you theoretically are installing all of the components of it before you even boot the game up. That's how I did with this. So as an example, when I originally installed this game to start messing around with it, I selected single player, multiplayer, and the high resolution textures for both. And as far as I could tell from the download list it was showing me, it was installing all of these things because it did each one individually. And then I booted the game up, and the only thing I could actually mess around with was the multiplayer, because despite telling it to install all of these things, it didn't actually install all of them. It only installed the multiplayer mode. I had to go into the installation settings and specifically tell it to install the campaign and the high resolution textures. and it had to re-download all of those things while I was within the game. That is one of the stupidest things I have ever seen in a video game. You specifically select what to install, but you have to install it twice, because for whatever baffling reason, you are required to install them from within the game itself. It makes no sense, and I have absolutely no idea why or how they set it up this way. It just makes no sense and is incredibly annoying when you're first starting the game up. Thankfully, you only have to do it the first time you're starting the game up. You just select what you want to install, and it's done once it's installed, so from then on out, it'll just run updates normally and you won't have to worry about it. But the fact that you basically have to install the game twice is just bafflingly stupid. Anyway, if you do have the campaign installed, then you'll start seeing the levels that you've actually completed, and then once you've actually completed the campaign, if you scroll down one more time, you'll find a big uninstall button that says, "Congratulations, you've completed the campaign. Play again to complete challenges or uninstall single player to save space." It's like they're almost embarrassed by it. But then after that, you finally get to the multiplayer. And the first option you're going to have access to is the custom search, which I will come back to here in a moment. And the rest of the options are going to be whatever the playlists they have set up are. So these are going to be things like attack and defend, or specifically breakthrough, or conquest, or all-out warfare, or whatever it may well be. And they may or may not be closed weapon. That's something I'll talk about more in a moment. But whatever the case, these playlists change, so you may not necessarily be able to find what you're looking for here. This is where the custom search comes in, where you can select which maps you want to play and which modes you want to play, and then go into the matchmaking queue for them. You can't select whether you want closed weapon or not, just the maps and modes, and not all of the modes are available on all of the maps. So the custom search actually isn't all that helpful unless there's only one specific map with one specific mode that you're looking for. You might think to yourself, oh, well, there's a server browser option in the menu there. I'll just go into that and find the server that I actually want to play on. Not so fast, buddy. That's only for community experiences. What are those, I hear you asking? Well, that's where all of the Battlefield Portal stuff is. So if you go into the server browser, you're not actually getting the main servers that you would be playing on if you just jump into the matchmaking queue. Instead, you're only getting the Portal mode content. And instead of having the wacky, unique experiences that they showcased in their unveiling of the Portal mode, what's actually available in the Portal mode is a big old pile of bot farms. And despite the name community experiences, these are not community-run persistent servers where, for example, you'll have a server admin who can go in and ban people if they want. No. These are all entirely controlled by EA, and like all of the servers in the game, they are temporary. They will shut themselves down once the match is over, and then spin themselves back up for whatever they're needed for next. That is the direct opposite of a community experience. A community experience would be a community-run dedicated server that is up 24/7, or as long as the actual hardware is running. And not only would there be admins who run the server, make sure it's going smoothly, and ensure that everyone is playing by the server's rules, but you could actually develop a community around a server like that, like we used to back in the day, where you would hop into the server browser and look for a server that had a rule set you liked and had a good enough ping to you. You would jump into the server and you would just start playing, and you would be able to play with the same people on a regular basis because the server was persistent, and because people would tend to frequent servers that they liked, you would run into the same people over and over again. You would maybe become friends with these regulars of the server, and you would actually build a sense of community. Battlefield was certainly that way back in the day, but ever since the consoles started taking over and people wanted more convenience in their multiplayer matches, matchmaking became the norm, and a sense of community continued to further and further shatter until there's nothing left anymore. There is no sense of community anymore in gaming. And so calling the Portal mode community experiences is extremely disingenuous at absolute best. And at worst, it comes across as an outright mockery of what we used to have, not only in the Battlefield series, but in multiplayer gaming as a whole. Even though it was considerably better than what we have now, especially from the AAA space. There are still a few indie and more AA type games that do actually have community-run dedicated servers and such like that. Example there being stuff like Hell Let Loose or Arma or other games like that. So in games like that, you can still foster a sense of community, but that can't happen in Battlefield 6 because you just can't play with the same people on a regular basis unless you keep them in your party the entire time, and most people aren't just going to add random people to their friends list when they are playing a game these days. I mean, hell, we didn't even really do that back in the day. We would play multiple matches with these people, and after we had played enough with them and felt comfortable with them, we would start adding them to our friends list then. But because modern multiplayer games just don't have any persistent servers, you can't play with the same people on a regular basis, at least not easily, unless you already have them in your friends list and are trying to coordinate with them to begin with. So the so-called community experiences in Battlefield 6 are pretty much anything but that, and so the server browser is effectively useless for you. So what does that mean if you're trying to, say, play the traditional Battlefield experience, where each class has specific weapons that are only available to them, which in the context of Battlefield 6 means that the Assault class is the only one that gets access to assault rifles, Engineer gets access to PDWs or submachine guns, the Support class gets access to light machine guns, and the Recon class gets access to sniper rifles? Well, you have to hope that you can hop into one of the closed weapon playlists, and those are going to be split into two separate things. There's either going to be all-out warfare, or there's going to be attack and defend. The all-out warfare playlists are specifically Conquest and Escalation only, with Conquest being the traditional Battlefield mode where each side is fighting over numerous control points on the map that will allow them to gradually reduce the respawn ticket count of their opponents until eventually one side wins when the other side's respawn tickets bottom out. Escalation is a spin on the Conquest mode, only instead of trying to reduce the enemy's respawn tickets to 0, you're trying to hold more positions on the map than the other team does, and eventually, if you hold them long enough, then you will be considered to have captured a sector, and then one of the points on the map will be eliminated, and then you'll continue fighting over the remaining points on the map, and the process will continue to repeat until eventually one team manages to win at least 3 of these rounds. If you want the Rush and Breakthrough modes, where Rush is one team trying to destroy the defending team's MCOM stations, and the defending team trying to prevent the attacking team from destroying those MCOM stations until the attacking team's respawn tickets run out. And if the attacking team manages to destroy all the MCOM stations within the current sector, then it will move on to the next sector, and the process will repeat until eventually either the defending team wins or the attacking team manages to destroy the last MCOM station and they will win. And Breakthrough being a similar idea, only instead of the attacking team trying to destroy an MCOM station, they're trying to simply capture all of the points within a given sector, and the defending team is trying to deplete their respawn tickets. And if the attacking team manages to capture all of the points in the sector, then it will move on to the next sector, and this process will continue until eventually either the attacking team's respawn tickets run out, or the attacking team manages to capture all of the sectors. Those are in the Attack and Defend playlist. So what if you want to play a mixture of those modes, but you also want them to be closed weapons? Well, too bad. You can go into the custom search and specifically select the modes you want to play, but you can't pick whether they're closed weapon or not. And when you go into the matchmaking queue there, it's not going to sort you into closed weapon modes. It's only going to sort you into the open weapon modes, where anybody can use whatever the hell they want. Thing is that closed weapons are how the series has always worked, and frankly, how it should work for a game that is ostensibly supposed to promote teamwork and combined arms warfare. Each class is supposed to have a very specific role, and so the gear and weapons any particular class can use should emphasize the role that class is meant to play. Hence, the Assault class gets assault rifles. In most of these modern military shooter type games, assault rifles are a very good all-around weapon where they're good at close range and medium range. They usually have fairly rapid reloads. They have magazine capacities large enough to be able to take down a couple of enemies in fairly quick succession as long as their aim is true, and the damage output tends to be rather solid, making it perfect for somebody who's meant to be a frontliner and get into the nitty-gritty of combat. Engineers, on the other hand, are meant to be the vehicle specialists, so they hang out around the vehicles, they keep them repaired, and if somebody gets too close to the vehicle to, say, throw down landmines or throw explosive charges on it, their submachine guns can make quick work of whoever's getting up close and personal. Meanwhile, the support class is meant to be, well, providing support. They can deploy cover, they can throw health packs down, they can revive teammates, and they are also meant to be able to lay down a lot of suppressive fire. What do they use for that? Light machine guns. They have a high ammo capacity, they do a respectable amount of damage, they have a decent range to them, and their ability to put down a high volume of fire means that theoretically you can keep the enemy's heads down and prevent them from sticking their heads out of cover in order to allow your teammates to work towards that objective that those enemies are defending. And then there's the recon class, which is meant to be providing intelligence to their teammates. They're supposed to be spotting enemies and spotting enemy vehicles, and using the information the recons are gathering, a team should be able to find weaknesses in enemies' defenses and exploit those weaknesses. Now, of course, in doing all this, it generally means that recons are going to want to be in advantageous positions where they can see an awful lot of the battlefield, meaning that they're probably going to be further away from the action, which in turn means that they need something that can reach out to long range and preferably take out individual targets in very short order, because if they're spotting all of these things, they might be able to spot a very well-placed defender and take them out with a single shot, so that their teammates can work into the gaps of defense after that. Hence, the recon class gets access to sniper rifles. At least that is how the class system in Battlefield has worked ever since they condensed the classes in Bad Company down to only 4, instead of having 6 like they did back in Battlefield 2. I know that's utterly inconceivable to modern Battlefield players, but back in the heyday of this franchise, we had a dedicated assault class, which was basically a grenadier. They had an assault rifle with a grenade launcher. There was a dedicated medic class that could revive teammates with the defibrillator and could also throw down medical supplies. There was a dedicated anti-tank class that had a submachine gun and an anti-vehicle launcher. There was a dedicated engineer class, which was armed with a shotgun and was specifically oriented around repairing vehicles only, whereas the anti-tank class obviously is specifically oriented towards destroying vehicles. There was a support class, which had the machine gun and could also throw down ammo packs to resupply teammates. There was a dedicated sniper class, whose entire purpose was to use sniper rifles to pick off enemies at long range. And then there was a special forces class, which was given a carbine as well as a suppressed pistol, and their job was to sneak behind enemy lines and basically conduct sabotage. They were able to destroy vehicles or to destroy commander resources, which of course would weaken the enemy team and allow your team to exploit those weaknesses. And that system worked very well, but you gotta remember, Battlefield 2 was only available on PC. So when they brought the franchise to console, they decided to consolidate a lot of those roles down into a smaller selection of classes, and you end up with the 4-class selection that they have today, and which they have absolutely struggled to balance ever since they implemented it in the first place. In particular, they've always seemed to have a problem with how the recon role is supposed to function. They tried to consolidate some of the ideas of the Special Forces class into the Sniper class, and so you're supposed to be intelligence gathering, but also be able to sneak behind enemy lines and lay charges and things like that. But they've always had a problem with people severely misusing that class, because one of the things they gave it is the deploy beacon. The idea there being that because the recon is meant to be sneaky, they can sneak behind enemy lines, place down a deploy beacon, and then their squad can spawn on that beacon and get behind enemy lines and sabotage enemy defenses and things like that. In this way, the recon was meant to set up offensive actions for your team, but the reality was very different from that. Instead of setting up offensive actions for your team, recons would just go somewhere in the map that gave them really good sightlines, place down a deploy beacon, and then just sit there and snipe people from across the map. And if somebody happened to spot them and counter-snipe them, then they would just respawn at that deploy beacon and start all over again. I'm sure some of the time they would also use these advantageous sightlines to actually spot enemies for their team, but that was very rare. Instead, they would just snipe and just continue to snipe the entire match and basically be utterly useless to their team. So that's been a problem plaguing the series ever since Bad Company, but they've also had constant issues working out the balance of the other classes as well. In particular, ever since they tried to consolidate the 6 classes down into 4, they have had constant problems with the medic, assault, and support roles. they've never really seemed to be able to figure out what kind of gear they want the medic using, whether they want them to be able to lay down suppressive fire, or they want them to be using submachine guns, or they want them to be using assault rifles, or whatever the case may be. They can't decide whether they want it to be a frontline combatant like the assault class, where some of the games in the series they have been the assault class. They can't really seem to decide if they want to consolidate all of the support roles, the machine gunners, the dropping ammo and dropping health and reviving teammates, all into a single class, or whether they want to keep those roles separate. They just don't really seem to know what to do with them, and so they have just been constantly going back and forth on which class is actually the medic, which class is actually a support class, and which class is actually the assault class, and it's just never clicked. Really, the only class that they have managed to figure out is the engineer. They just made the engineer the vehicle specialist. They're good at repairing them, and they're good at destroying them, and that's fine. They can consolidate that down into a single role without any problems. But with these other classes, they can't really figure out what they want to do with them. And for years, I have maintained that the best thing they could do is to split up some of those roles again. Just have a dedicated medic class, a dedicated support class, and a dedicated assault class again. But even if they did implement separate classes for these again, it wouldn't really matter with the current setup, where the primary mode of play in Battlefield 6 is open weapons, anybody being able to use anything. So as a prime example, they decided to counter the recon going to the edge of the map and just sitting there sniping all the time problem by removing the deploy beacon from the recon class and giving it to the assault class instead. Now theoretically, the assault class is probably the best class to give that to, except there's one problem. If you don't restrict the weapons, then you can end up with the exact same problem of people just playing the assault class, picking a sniper rifle instead, going some random place in the map, placing down the spawn beacon, and then just continuing to do the exact same thing they did in the previous games that was such an annoying problem. And the funny thing about this is they knew it wouldn't solve the problem because of the open weapon system, so they made the deploy beacon destroy itself whenever the person who placed it down respawns on it, and then you have a cooldown until you can actually place another deploy beacon. And well, you know, that didn't fix the problem either. You know what would fix the problem? Restricting weapons so that the assault class can't just spawn in with a sniper rifle and keep doing the same thing they would have been doing in previous Battlefield games that had the radio beacon assigned to the recon class. If you don't restrict what the class is capable of using, then people aren't going to play the class the way it is meant to be played. And if people aren't playing the class the way it's meant to be played, then guess what? The entire class system breaks down and there's not much point to having it in the first place. The especially funny thing here is we saw that play out with Battlefield 2042. They more or less tried to do away with the class system entirely, and not only did pretty much everybody hate it, but it made the game play like complete garbage. They did eventually try to work the classes back in with subsequent updates, but it never really worked properly, and it was abundantly clear, no matter what you were doing, that it was not meant to be played with a class system. Now, the really funny thing about Battlefield 6 in this regard is that when they first announced the game and started talking about it, they were like, look, we saw that people really hated the specialist system and the lack of classes in Battlefield 2042, so we hear you on that, and we're bringing back the classes with Battlefield 6. But what they didn't tell you until later on was that open weapons was going to be the primary way of playing Battlefield 6, and that closed weapons were going to be a more or less side way of playing that they almost hide in the menus and don't let you search for in the custom search feature, thus making it fairly annoying to try to play this game the way a Battlefield game should function and actually have some variety instead of only playing two modes back to back over and over again. And variety is a problem with this game in general, because this game only launched with 9 maps, and most of them feel very similar to one another. In fact, most of them are very small, very cramped, and don't actually have full combined arms warfare. There are only 4 maps in the entire game, as I am recording this video in Season 1, that actually have full combined arms, where you have ground vehicles in the form of course, personnel carriers, but also light and main battle tanks, as well as jets and both transport and attack helicopters. And that's including the new map they added in the onset of Season 1. At launch, it was only 3 out of the 9 total maps. You had Operation Firestorm, Mirac Valley, and Liberation Peak. And with the new map they introduced on the onset of Season 1, Blackwell Fields, that brings the proper combined arms maps up to a whopping 4 maps in total out of the 10 maps that are actually in the game right now. Of the rest of the maps, at absolute best, they have heavily restricted combined arms, in the form of maybe you can have a light tank or maybe a main battle tank, and if you're on New Sobek City, you might have an attack helicopter, but otherwise it's almost exclusively infantry versus infantry, and it ends up just feeling like Call of Duty's ground war mode rather than Battlefield. In fact, that's something that generally plagues the gameplay experience of Battlefield 6. No matter which map you're playing on, no matter which mode you're playing, it doesn't really feel like a Battlefield game as much as it feels like Call of Duty's ground war mode. What do I mean by that? Well, Call of Duty introduced the ground war mode in its current incarnation back in Modern Warfare 2019, and it was basically just an upscaled domination mode where you're trying to capture and hold positions on the map. So instead of 3 positions to capture and hold on the map, you would have 5 positions. They introduced armored vehicles that you could drive around that were basically just light tanks. And there were also helicopters flying around the map in set patterns that you could spawn into and then jump somewhere into the map. But obviously the focus was primarily on infantry gameplay, just at a larger scale. When you look at Battlefield 6, look at all the various maps and modes that are on display. Unless you're playing on those 4 large-scale combined arms maps that I mentioned previously, you're really getting a very close experience to what we got with Call of Duty's ground war mode, and if you're playing Domination, King of the Hill, Squad Deathmatch, or Team Deathmatch, it outright just feels like Call of Duty, but with a higher player count than normal. Because those modes are only available on the really tightly cramped maps that basically feel like Call of Duty maps anyway. It's just that they've tacked a class system on top of it that never really works out well because the players tend to reject the class system more than actually embrace it. And that leads into the main thing that makes this feel more like Call of Duty than Battlefield: the players themselves. You see, the vast majority of the longtime Battlefield players no longer play Battlefield. They haven't played Battlefield for a very long time. They have either moved on from gaming entirely because they're busy and just don't have time to play games anymore, or they have moved on from multiplayer games or first-person shooters, or they have specifically moved on from the Battlefield series because it no longer offered the experience that they were looking for in that teamwork-oriented combined arms warfare, and instead, they look to games like Hell Let Loose, or Squad, or Arma, all of which offer combined arms warfare with heavy teamwork emphasis. This means that the vast majority of the Battlefield 6 player base is composed of Call of Duty converts. People who've just migrated over to Battlefield because they didn't like the direction that the Call of Duty series was going, and they chose to either spite the Call of Duty series by going into the Battlefield series, or they wanted a Call of Duty-esque gameplay experience, but at a much larger scale than what Call of Duty normally offers with its absolutely tiny maps. And it is abundantly clear when you're running into these kinds of players because they clearly have no idea how to play Battlefield. They'll pick a class but won't actually play the role of that class. I have lost count of the number of supports I have seen who simply do not revive people at all. They just run around and shoot at enemies with their machine guns. Because one of the big things that is supposed to differentiate the classes is that each of them gets passive bonuses to using their signature weapons, which are the ones that in the closed weapon mode are restricted to them, and the weapon bonuses for the support class obviously give them bonuses with light machine guns. More specifically, it makes the recoil a lot more manageable, and so they'll just use the support class as a glorified assault class that can restore its own ammo and also have extremely large magazines. I have legitimately played multiple matches where I got revived more by engineers, recons, and assaults than supports. That should not be happening, and yet it does. Regularly in Battlefield 6, because the vast majority of the Battlefield 6 player base doesn't really know how to play Battlefield. They don't understand that it's meant to be a slower-paced, more strategic, teamwork-oriented game, and so they make minimal use of their class's gadgets. They just run around like headless chickens, thinking that it's going to be all infantry combat or maybe vehicle combat if it happens to be a map that actually emphasizes vehicles, and they almost never seem to have any kind of grasp on how to actually play their class or how to play the objective. And the absolute worst aspect of it is the complete lack of communication. Nobody communicates in this game. I have played this thing for over 40 hours. I have had my voice chat enabled the entire time, and quite literally the only time I ever heard anyone even attempting to coordinate with their teammates was, weirdly enough, when I was playing the Battle Royale mode. As for actually playing the main modes of the game, like Conquest, Rush, Breakthrough, Escalation, all of that, you will find yourself inundated with complete silence. Nobody communicating. Nobody attempting to work together as a team. Nobody attempting to coordinate strategy. Nothing. And that is a downright fatal flaw in a game that is ostensibly supposed to be teamwork-oriented, because the game modes themselves still require teamwork in order to be successful. So that means that the vast majority of matches are hilariously one-sided. When it comes to the modes where the defending team has an advantage, like Rush and Breakthrough, the attacking team really only has two options. The first is just to completely rush the defending team's position before they really have a chance to actually set up, or to just hope that the defending team is so laughably incompetent that they can't mount a successful defense. Because all the defending team has to do is prevent the attacking team from either capturing the objectives or destroying the MCOM stations for long enough that their reinforcement tickets run out. The defenders don't need to worry about that because they have infinite respawn tickets. So they have a massive advantage over the attacking team. This has always been the case with these modes, regardless of which battlefield you're talking about. But if you go back to earlier entries in the series, like the ones where they introduced those modes, you would find they tended to be a lot more evenly matched, because even though players didn't communicate with their teammates quite as much as they did back in the classic Battlefield 2 days, they were still a lot more inclined to communicate back then, so you could still coordinate with your team. As of Battlefield 6, it is a complete crapshoot. You just jump into a match and hope that your team has a general idea of what to do, because about the only chance you're going to have at winning is if you somehow manage to get the magic single instance of a team that actually communicates with each other, or you just have to hope that each individual player has a general idea of how to play the game anyway, so the general competency of the team manages to overcome the lack of communication. Either way, you're going to be completely at the mercy of the matchmaking algorithm, and chances are you're going to end up with a subpar experience no matter what, simply because it's not being played the way that Battlefield is supposed to be played. You might think that they would implement some sort of tutorial sequence or guide on how to play the classes and how to play the various modes, but the absolute best you get is just some videos giving you a quick overview. And let's face it, the current generation of gamers certainly isn't going to go out of their way to watch these videos just to learn how to play the game. They're just not going to care. So the only chance you might have at actually educating these players how to play their classes and how to play for the objective is to include some sort of interactive tutorial, and nothing of the sort exists here. To make matters worse, to even access what limited information is available to teach you how to play the game properly, you have to scroll down rather far on the menu until you get to the training grounds section, and that is so poorly laid out that it is basically useless. It really gives the impression that the developers and, of course, the publisher EA have really no interest in making sure that people are playing this the way Battlefield is supposed to be played. In fact, if anything, it seems like they're trying to go out of their way to make it not feel like a Battlefield game, and make the players not want to play it like a Battlefield game. I mean, let's face it, the open weapons thing that I've been harping against for a while now, that was done not because it makes the gameplay more compelling or because it's better balanced or anything like that. It's obviously worse in the gameplay department than having restricted weapons, but rather because it's a lot more difficult to make money off of cosmetics if you're trying to sell them with a single skin applied to a single gun, and that gun is only accessible if you're playing a certain class. So obviously the solution there is just to let the player use whatever the hell they want, because then they can use the gun that they have purchased a skin for, and that will encourage even more spending, because once you spend even a little bit, whether it's on the battle pass or a single cosmetic or whatever it may well be, you're much more likely to spend even more money. Now, I will be fair in saying that all of the purchasable items are only cosmetics. They don't have any gameplay impact, at least not yet anyway. And thus far, they haven't gone too horribly wild with the cosmetics. There are certainly some that don't really look appropriate for a Battlefield game or just a serious war game in general, but at the very least, you don't have the likes of just Nicki Minaj running around, or Beavis and Butthead, or anything like that. At least, not yet. But regardless, the cosmetics they have are clearly meant for people who are either just playing exclusively the REDSEC mode, or people who just don't really care about the game maintaining its aesthetic. And that is pretty much the polar opposite of the kind of people that Battlefield normally appeals to. After all, there's a very good reason that the games they would migrate to are more realistic than Battlefield, not less realistic than it. And all this really does is show that EA's target audience with this game was not the Battlefield fanbase. It was the Call of Duty fanbase. The same audience they have been chasing for the better part of almost 2 decades now, and which has been driving this series further and further into the ground. But the big difference here compared to the previous Battlefield games is that the previous games at least had enough of the longtime fans around that you could still sometimes get a proper Battlefield experience that actually felt like everything was firing on all cylinders. As of Battlefield 6, there are just so few longtime Battlefield players and so few people working together as a team and communicating that you basically cannot get the actual Battlefield experience anymore. Instead, you're left with what feels more like Call of Duty Ground War than anything else, and to put it very simply, if I wanted to play Call of Duty Ground War, I would play Call of Duty Ground War. I wouldn't be playing Battlefield. But the unfortunate reality here is that this game was not made for Battlefield fans. Even though they do have the right modes, they have the class system, they do have technically combined arms warfare in the game, it's clearly de-emphasized in favor of infantry-on-infantry combat with maybe some light vehicle support at absolute best. And the infantry combat on display here isn't particularly good, because despite primarily aiming this game at the Call of Duty crowd, they still have mechanics that are more closely associated with combined arms warfare, even though they de-emphasize combined arms warfare with the distinct lack of maps that support it. So you still have things like cone of fire mechanics, where even if you're firing from simply aiming down your sights and not actually having to deal with recoil or anything, you're still not necessarily going to hit exactly what you're aiming at, as well as taking a surprisingly large amount of damage to actually drop an enemy, meaning that you're having to spend a lot more ammo than you'd really expect, as well as some fairly hefty recoil, which isn't that difficult to control, but most modern military shooter players are not used to having to do that because they're primarily used to Call of Duty, where pretty much everything is a laser and recoil is a lie. So despite having an emphasis on infantry versus infantry combat more so than combined arms warfare, the infantry combat itself just isn't all that great. It's not awful, but it's just not very good either, and it means that all of the small-scale infantry-focused modes just don't feel right for this game, and yet the main modes like Conquest, Rush, Escalation, and Breakthrough also don't feel quite right, because half of those, Breakthrough and Rush, have restricted player counts, and Conquest and Escalation are the only ones where you're actually going to get proper 64-player matches with combined arms. And then you start looking at all of the equipment that you unlock over the course of the progression, and most of it is weapons that you can use against other infantry, with the occasional gadget unlock here or there, and they're split between level-based unlocks, so you earn experience points by just playing the game regularly, and once you manage to collect enough of those, then you rank up, and you get some unlocks. But on top of that, they're also in challenges where you have to complete very specific objectives in order to unlock whatever it is, like get X amount of damage with, say, carbines, as well as so many kills with carbines to unlock this carbine, or something along those lines. And up until they rebalanced those very recently, those were insanely grindy. As in, so insanely grindy that even Battlefield 4's god-awful, insanely grindy unlock system was positively glowing by comparison. In fact, the grind is so severe, that's why the Portal mode is completely overrun with bot farms. And hell, even after they rebalanced a lot of these challenges and dramatically reduced the amount of stuff you have to do with them, there's still a few that are basically impossible to get during normal play, so Portal mode is still overrun with bot farms and not actually any of the interesting experiences that you might expect. bonus points there. You can't simply go into portal mode and start messing around with changing maps around and changing modes around from the game itself. You have to go to a completely external application to do that. But the especially funny thing is, even if you do try to grind out these challenges, they may still not work properly, because even though this game is definitely way more stable and way more of a functional piece of software than Battlefield 2042 was, it's still got a lot of glitches in it, and one of them is that sometimes the challenges just don't work. As a prime example, I can show you here where I have ostensibly unlocked the QBZ carbine, but it doesn't show as being unlocked in my loadouts, and I cannot equip it. But it also shows as me having completed the challenge that requires the QBZ unlock challenge to complete, and the unlocked gun for that works perfectly fine. So I just don't have something that I am supposed to have unlocked because the challenge didn't work properly. And who knows when or even if they'll ever fix that. As it stands, it's pretty abundantly clear the developers' priorities simply aren't in the right place. They were clearly targeting the Call of Duty crowd, and while they were certainly able to pull away a fair number of players from Call of Duty, it's hard to say whether they'll actually stick around. I mean, already the game seems to have lost roughly half of its player base, at least if Steam Chart is any indication, and Call of Duty Black Ops 7 just came out as I'm recording this audio right now, so we'll just have to see how player retention in Battlefield 6 works out versus the sales figures and player retention in Black Ops 7, but EA certainly aren't doing the Battlefield franchise any favors by shoehorning in modes like Strike Point, which takes place on a tiny section of the Blackwell Fields map, and is a 4v4 mode, because that's clearly what you want in a game that is supposed to be all about large-scale, combined arms warfare on 64-player servers. Clearly you want a 4v4 mode on a map so small it makes shipment from Call of Duty feel massive. Honestly, I'm not sure whether I should just be annoyed at them completely missing the point, or laugh at them completely missing the point. I don't really think it matters anymore, because it's abundantly clear that Battlefield is never going to reclaim its fallen glory. This is not a return to form for Battlefield. It's certainly a much better game than Battlefield 2042 was, but that's not saying much. Battlefield 2042 was so bad that I probably would have given it a 0.5 out of 5, or maybe even a 0 out of 5 on launch. And even these days, if I managed to play the game enough to be able to properly review it, it would probably still get about a 1 out of 5. Battlefield 6 is definitely not quite that terrible. It's got a lot of problems, it's got some technical problems, it's got a lot of design issues, and it's got a distinct lack of content, especially compared to its predecessors, that all need to be addressed very quickly if EA wants this thing to survive long term, and this very slow drip feed of content that they seem to be experimenting with here is just not going to cut it. But the especially sad part of this is that even if EA does address all of the gameplay concerns and actually makes it a true return to form for Battlefield, it's not going to matter, because the Battlefield crowd have moved on, and the people who have replaced them have no interest in playing this like a proper Battlefield game. They have no interest in teamwork. They have no interest in communication. And both of those things are absolutely required if you're going to have a proper Battlefield experience. And while some of you might say that I am effectively blaming this game's ultimate failure on the players rather than developers, it's actually the developers' fault, because they're the ones that targeted the crowd that wouldn't play this like a Battlefield game in the first place. And so, to summarize everything up here, the unfortunate reality of Battlefield 6 is that it is not remotely a so-called return to form for the Battlefield franchise. It's pretty much as far as you can get from that. But what it is certainly a hell of a lot better than Battlefield 2042, even though that's not saying much at all. It is at least mostly functional software. It has an actual single-player campaign. It has the proper multiplayer experience buried in there somewhere, even though the maps are too small and too cramped, and they're not well designed, and it is way too easy for one team to completely steamroll the other, pretty much regardless of which mode you're playing. And the developers have focused way too much on trying to cater cater to the Call of Duty crowd, even though the Call of Duty crowd really isn't all that interested in what makes Battlefield. So the overall experience has suffered greatly, and the ultimate kiss of death for this thing is that the players just don't play it like a proper Battlefield game. They don't communicate, they don't work together as a team, and so it is a complete crapshoot as to whether or not you're going to have a decent match or not. There's no persistent servers, there's no sense of community, the portal mode is a complete joke at this point, because it's been overrun by bot farms, and if you actually want to go into portal mode and create your own mode for yourself, you're going to have to do that in an external application instead of going directly into this game and doing it within this game. The UI is an absolute mess, the cosmetics are already starting to clash with the game's aesthetic, although thankfully not quite as severely as Call of Duty's does at this point, and they're also wildly overpriced. The exchange rate of Battlefield coins to US dollars comes out to 100 Battlefield coins per US dollar, and most of the prices are upwards of $8 or more for single skins, which is just ridiculous. And the cosmetics you're actually getting don't even look all that good anyway. But of course, since it's a modern live service game, and more specifically it's EA, already they are trying to push you into buying the Battle Pass and buying all the microtransactions, because at the end of the day, all they really care about is money. And to that end, they are trying to cast as wide a net as possible by really trying to push the Battle Royale mode, Battlefield REDSEC, which is severely undercooked and incredibly underwhelming. It's so weak it cannot stand on its own, and yet while REDSEC is free to play, the actual main game is $70 US for the standard edition, $100 for its deluxe edition or whatever it's called, and obviously your regional equivalent is going to vary wildly. And there is quite simply not enough on offer here of high enough quality for it to be remotely worth that asking price. All in all, in its current state, I give Battlefield 6 a 1.5 out of 5. This does at least mean that it's definitely a lot better than Battlefield 2042 and Battlefield 5, but that's not saying much. Thank you all very much for watching and bearing with me on how long this video is and how long it took to come out. It has been an absolute mess trying to get this video done, and I've had to do it because I'm so low on disk space because of all the recordings I had to make of this thing, so I hope you all enjoyed the video. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.